I wanted to do something maybe a little specific to the Zoom format that I wouldn't do in a regular lecture. Like I travel light, so I would never take props with me, and I've got like, you know, all sorts of things that I want to show, and I can also share some screens. And yeah, I wanted mostly to talk about being a writer, but trying to get out of only writing in the print media and not thinking of the other things as kind of secondary or add-on, but as sort of integral to the whole practice. So sort of what is writing in a kind of, what's writing in an expanded field, to like steal somebody else's title, I think was part of the project. And particularly someone who came out of the end of the, if you like, Fordist era of media production, where, you know, I was trained in how to do print production. I was trained in radio, you know, back before it went digital. Little bit of film and video, but not so much. But then, you know, sort of seeing all of those things sort of transform. Like my first academic job was teaching desktop publishing, which was 1988 or so. I don't even remember, sometime in the 80s. And I wanted to sort of show some of the objects and tell the story of all of those things, starting with when I used to co-edit this journal, which is actually called Intervention. This single issue was called Flesh. And that was like a hybrid production in the sense that the typesetting was all already digital, but we were still making it in, you know, in the sense by, you know, doing letraset and cutting up galleys with scalpels and, you know, putting them down with a waxer and all that sort of thing. Oh, there's a nice page. The late Stephen Cummings, who's since passed. So, and I was doing print production, I think, because I ended up as a writer because I'm completely musically incompetent. I was too musically incompetent even for punk rock. Like I could not play the 3 chords. So I ended up in the lowest form of that entire sector, which was music journalism, which was, you know, was my first job. And you know, so I'm not going to do that. I can't draw. I have no visual sense whatsoever. So it's going to be writing. And then, all right, as like a baby Marxist, I thought I want to understand the means of production. Like that's how I got involved as a writer and trying to figure out how to actually make printed objects. And for a while, I was even co-owner of a printing press. I don't think we ever even made a single thing on it, but that was like an object lesson in, well, actually, you can sort of stop, you know, being involved. You don't have to be vertically integrated personally through all of the levels of an industry. Or that kind of would have been fun if I got that far. And like a lot of people of that era, I made objects that are now kind of like dead media. You know, that was the CD-ROM. Peter, did you make a CD-ROM? Did you ever?
Indeed.
Yes. Yeah. So that like dates you, you know, like when it's like, oh, great, multimedia is awesome, but the internet wasn't yet a thing. And then of course, it's called Planet of Noise. I made it with Brad Miller. And, you know, that came with this, I think, really quite lovely printed objects that's, and the whole text was aphoristic. Yeah, so I was sort of like doing all this stuff in the 90s and attempting to figure out what place is writing going to have if, and there was a lot of concern about whether the book would get displaced. And weirdly, the book's kind of done all right in terms of the fate of previous media artifacts. And maybe because, I mean, the book's not as old as we sort of think it is. The book's maybe a product, the book as we think of it now is kind of a product of, you know, sort of mass production, maybe back to the 1920s, 1930s would shape the book as we kind of think of it, like the advent of the paperback, for example. But somehow it's sort of stuck more than certain other media forms, sort of, you know, sort of been displaced by digitization. But I sort of thinking about, yeah, I'm thinking I was writing it in the expanded field has sort of been the project. And I got to play a lot more in Australia because I had access to the national broadcaster. I made radio. I had access to newspapers. I had a newspaper column. I kind of lost all those things when I emigrated. So it was a question of inventing different sorts of practices involving, you know, access to different sorts of media. And then I just want to talk about some of the projects and the side projects that kind of came off them. And Peter, at some point, I'm going to need to share my own screen. I don't know if
Yes.
I've...
Are you? I think you should be a co-host already, but
Right. Yeah.
I'll
So that'll
check.
come up in a minute. And so Hacker Manifesto, which was the book that enabled me to stay in the United States, because I kind of actually wrote that about 1999. I didn't get it out till 2004. It got turned down like 5 times. Everybody rejected it. And at some point I just sort of thought, I got nothing to lose. I'll send it to Harvard University Press. And the wonderful Lindsay Waters called me literally 3 days later and said, we're doing that. This never happens. It was because of that I ended up staying here. But I had this long discussion about what would be the visual style of this artifact. And the thing I insisted was that it needed to be classical. I didn't want anything that looked like cyberspace, because you know how that stuff dates so quickly. So we ended up with this look. And then when I went on tour with it, my handler in, I think, LA, was a Verdun practitioner and said, those are the colors of Yeshun, God of the Crossroads. So I was like, yes, I'll take it. So that book was written in an imaginary language that I call European. And European is made up of equal parts Church Latin for the abstract nouns, Marxism, and business English. So those are the 3 sort of strands of it. And I wrote as much of it in using those lexicons as I possibly could. And the other thing that was relevant to its fate is it doesn't have page numbers. It's all numbered paragraphs. Because I thought the problem with page numbers when you move into the digital era is that they're relative to a particular edition. And so it doesn't give you a location in any edition. It only gives you a location in that edition. And I wanted a referencing system that would be stable. So I could put bits of it online and that it could be translated, because I kind of thought I wanted that one to travel. And it turned out, writing this like weird, obscure prose poem in this made-up language is the book I've sold most copies of in my entire freaking life. So I don't know how that worked. But it made it translatable as well. It turns out that abstract nouns from one end of Europe to the other with some interesting little anomalies mostly come from Latin. That business English had made the same inroads. The word for hacker is hacker in all European languages. The word for manifesto is manifesto. The word for abstraction is abstraction. So this is like really interesting continuity in terms of how the translation worked when I did that one. One of the anomalies is Greek. The Greek language has its own abstract nouns because they invented philosophy, which then had to be translated into Latin. So it didn't track into that one. But the Hungarian edition, the title page looks almost exactly the same. Yeah, so it's state, hacker, representation, information, subject, vector. Like they're all recognizable from the same Latin roots. So, and it's kind of playing with the spaces that history had made through culture, right? Because Catholic Church, Anglo-centric dominance in capitalism, workers' movement, were the things that had pan-European histories. And I'll just have one other edition of that because it's my favorite, is the Croatian, this beautiful, the binding, it's designed so this one will sit flat. This one was done by Mama. Some people might know the Tommy Medak and people there. But then the numbers work exactly the same way. So you can compare any paragraph in any edition. Of course, you go from one end of Europe to the other. There's also a Japanese edition. There's I can only read the Roman bits in that. There's a pirate Chinese edition. So it's escaped the European orbit, but these aren't cultures I'm confident in it at all. And I was kind of interested to see that, but I sort of thought at least a write in European would be the project for that particular book. The way it escaped was I kind of couldn't get Harvard to agree to do Creative Commons. So I just straight up told them, well, it'll be free on the internet. So, it just is. And, legal were not very happy about that, but it just became a fait accompli. So I put the different sections on different list servers. It came out of list server culture to begin with. Like I was a member of NetTime, which is where Peter and I probably met actually, was in list servers in the 90s. And it went back there. So it was like returning it to the practice of writing that had generated it in the first place. So I want to see if I can share my screen, but first of all, I have to get that to go away, and then I put that up. And then we go down to share screen, and I want to share that one. And there we go. Is that visible to everybody? Yep, great. So the book after that was Gamer Theory, and I write a lot using constraints, which I learned from the sort of Olupo group. And they were, when I did Hacker Manifesto, the numbered paragraphs are hard numbered. So if I wanted to add anything in the middle, I had to renumber every single paragraph. Now I know you could write a macro and automate that, but I chose not to prevent myself from adding digressions because I felt like I was too digressive. I kept that with Gamer Theory. I can't show you the physical book, which is also, you know, beautifully designed by Harvey because I don't even have copies at home. But I wanted to add constraints to that, and the constraints for Gamer Theory included that the chapters would be arranged alphabetically. It would be like an ABC of gamer culture, but it would only go from A to C. So as you can see, it starts with agony, allegory, America, analog, atopia, battle, boredom, complex, and conclusions. Like that's it. Like there's no, you know, there's no D to Z. So that was the first thing. So the chapters had to arrange themselves around an alphabetical order. There's exactly 25 paragraphs in each chapter. And then no single paragraph could be more than, I think it was 200 words, were all the constraints. And then each chapter would be about a single game and a single concept. So when I ended up working with Institute for the Future of the Book, which was sort of Bob Stein and some people who worked for him, we sort of got to think about how we would design a kind of interface for that would be specific to it, but from which we might sort of learn some things. Bob was very interested in network books, of how you could use different kind of spaces for writing. Bob was very invested in collaborative writing practices online, which I'm not. Like I kind of really like to be sole author sometimes. So this is like a little bit of a compromise in the sense that I had a complete draft of the book. It went up online, and we created this interface that will only work because there's the same number of chapters, same number of paragraphs in each chapter. And I like the sort of spatial arrangement where you would think about the paragraphs as being, you know, these cards that would sort of like layer on top of each other. I got it, where that came from is sitting on top of the cistern of the toilet at the Institute for the Future of the Book was the oblique strategy cards that Brian Eno designed. And I literally went in there to, you know, take a restroom break, and I played with the cards. And rather than take a cue from what was written on the card, I took a cue from the cards and kind of thought, what if we just designed the whole thing as like stacks of cards? And then it's all in sets of 5 because we have the 25s. And then we, when I say we, I take credit for that part. And the other thing I said is I want the comments to go alongside the paragraphs. Because as a writer, the thing that was not working at the time was that you would get, you know, comments after your text on the internet at the bottom of it about the text in general or about a typo, but nothing addressed the sort of paragraph level construction of the prose. So we designed this deliberately so that for each individual paragraph, the comments can come in at exactly that level. And it ended up being extremely helpful for writing the version 2. So we put this out for comment. This thing later became Comment Press as a plugin for WordPress, which I don't know if it still exists because I think there's an update of WordPress where it stopped working at some point. But that was how we were doing that. The other thing we learned is that it was in the sweet spot of texts you can put out on the internet at that point in time where you would get really interesting feedback from the audience and from readers. So we got it from people in media theory, we got it from gamers. This is pre-Gamergate, right? Like this was a moment when you could actually have a kind of interaction without it sort of sparking certain things. So yeah, that was gamer theory. And then after I'd done Hacker Manifesto and gamer theory, I kind of felt like, oh, I kind of like didn't build in the preparatory steps to explain how I got there. So I kind of felt there was work to do to sort of say what this had grown out of. And that was when I did Beach Beneath the Street. So it's like, yeah, well, I kind of, one of the things I was reading was Situations International. Like this was all thinking about spectacle and détournement is, I think, the two key concepts in Situations lexicon that have a kind of dialectical relationship. You're inside the society of the spectacle, it's all enclosing, but détournement, which attacks culture at the level of property rather than at the level of content, is your sort of tool in and against it. So yeah, I ended up doing two and a half books on Situations. Boy, did I get carried away with that. I kind of got, talk about detour and détournement. And then I got to work with the Vectors Journal people at USC. And this became a standalone project. I'll see if the audio will play when we finally get it to work. Here we go. All right, so I'll just take that off for a sec. And the artwork was all done by Kevin Pyle, and this was working around the problem that I did not want to pay Guy Debord's widow for rights to use photos, and nor did I want to pay, sort of Bill Gates and freaking photo libraries that end up owning all this stuff. Because you kind of taking a little bit more of a risk with images than with other forms of media, really, and particularly now with moving images or also with music. So what I did was I sort of like made this huge photo library and gave it to Kevin Pyle and said, all right, can you reverse engineer the photos into a comic strip that gives us the ambience from which the Situations International came? Can you give us that sort of 50s demi-monde? Which he did, and I think Kevin was a good collaborator to pick because he'd done a book called Lab USA, so he's interested in sort of documentary comics. And he'd been involved in constructed situations in New York City, and it just so happened I'd been to them in the 90s. I can't remember the group, but you just wander into a warehouse and there's like techno playing and there's like a giant block of ice and there's like sort of inflatable sculptures everywhere, and then the whole thing's gone by the next morning or when the cops arrive. So it's like, oh, you kind of get this on some level, So Kevin ended up being a good collaborator for that. And the song is a French folk song, hence no copyright. And there's a whole strand in proto Situation that's got to do with French folk music that I was excavating because they were all kind of obsessed with that stuff. So that was the project that kind of grew out of, how do you make the visual life of the Situations International something that people can relate to, and that sort of comic strip stuff came as a fold-out poster that was wrapped around the hardback editions of the book. That was my first book to sell out, was that hardback, so I think that strategy kind of worked. And every now and then people find me because they've seen the poster but they don't know it came from the book. They're like, oh, you did this comic strip thing, and I'm like, yeah, it was the cover of a book, but it ends up on people's walls, and so it circulates in a slightly different way, which is kind of nice. So you go to a party and see this thing and not know that that's where it kind of came from. Straight up stole that from those Crass records that came with fold-out posters. I kind of thought that was kind of cool, and you'd see that and figure out who the band was and so on. So that was one of two projects that grew out of the Situationist stuff that came with the first of the two books. It ended up probably a bad idea to split it into two volumes. No one ever buys sequels. I kind of, being petite bourgeois by origin, I kind of want my publishers to make money, not so that I make money, but so that publishers survive. Like, I like the books to be viable as objects. And the book of mine that was slowest to earn out its advance was the sequel to Beach Me at the Street, which was called Spectacle of Disintegration. But the little project I did around that was to 3D print Guy Debord figurines. This got me in so much trouble with the people who think they're the heirs to the Situationist legacy and kind of police it. I called them action figures, which collectors of these things really dislike because the limbs don't actually move. And when I'm asked, often in a confrontational way, what is the action? I have two answers. One is smoking and the other is revolution. Like, he is doing revolution in this figurine. There's a little group of them. I only ever made 6 of them. This was the second set in color. There are 2 which are actually slightly better, done with slightly different material, which I think I was the first edition. So only 2 of the first edition, and they're both owned by former members of the Situationists International, which I'm quite proud of. Michelle Bernstein has one and Jacqueline de Jong has the other. So there's the action figures. I worked with a toy designer who was losing work because he'd originally learned how to do it doing wood models, and it had to, you know, shed a lot of labor. He was just down to doing this alone with making these 3D models. So I was able to, you know, make use of his abilities, and a grad student who got the sintering machine to actually work for us here at Parsons School of Design. There's the machine. The little foot was detachable. You had to like glue the foot back on to make the whole figurine. And there's the they have to be cured after you make them. There's the curing happening. These ones have these beautiful texture on the back, even though I wasn't quite so happy with the finish on the colored ones. I was kind of using it as like a promotional thing. Here it is with the cover of the book, or with both books. I made a whole bunch of pictures of them at the New School. You can download the STL file to make your own. So I made Guy Debord open source, so you can go get that and make your own figurine, and people started making them and sending me pictures of them. Yeah, I think that's all in this little like French newsletter was like talking about the whole process of that one. It was meant to be a bit of a provocation. I got accused of selling toys. They were never for sale. I gave away the few that I'd made, and also made, you know, freely available the STL to make your own. Then there are some détournements of that figure. I'm sorry, I forgot to find a website of that, but people can do mashups of Debord with Eduardo Catch. There's one where there's like an ear on the back of the figurine. There's a mashup with Japanese anime where there's like mecha added to the body and so on. So I kind of like the sense of détournement happening with the figure as well. But the sort of ethnographic side of it was kind of fascinating, that some people have no problem at all sharing photographs of Situationists, but somehow it crossed a line to make that back into a 3-dimensional figure. Like somehow that was somehow not to be done, which I find kind of interesting. And it's kind of interesting to like push the boundaries around these things a little bit sometimes. So then after doing these 2 books on Situationists as ways of explaining what the hell I was trying to do with Hacker Manifesto and Gamer Theory, I then had to explain why the hell I was interested in the Situationists. So I sort of like went back even further to sort of do like some sort of reparative history on, not ready for that one yet, on the history of Marxism, because I love all the like weird sort of perverse side projects that grew out of it. I'm somehow a little resistant to orthodoxies. And when I did Molecular Red, I sort of, wouldn't it be fun to kind of create a sort of heretical version of Marxism that goes back to the split between Lenin and a character called Alexander Bogdanov in 1904, that sort of sets the Bolsheviks on a certain course, one of which being a somewhat dogmatic idea about philosophy. So I was like, it would be great if there was like this whole other version that was sort of much more open-ended and kind of creative, which was open to the sciences, which had a kind of much more open-ended idea about art and so on. So I sort of wrote the book where that's the first half. I obviously no business doing that because, like, you know, my terrible French got me through writing about situationists. So I don't have Russian at all. But it's like, frankly, it's making books like designers. Like, designers don't know what the hell they're working with most of the time, right? Yeah, but you learn it. Like, you go the same way as like you're a journalist. You go study it and you go find the people who might actually know something about it. So that's what I did. Unlike the people who think they own situationists, the people who think they're keeping Bogdanov alive were wonderfully welcoming and so open and such wonderful collaborators. So I was able to, first half of that's all about Bogdanov and Andrei Platonov, a wonderful writer who I think had a little bit, who took a little bit from Bogdanov. Problem is no one's read any of this stuff and some of it's incredibly rare. So the reader was the sort of way of getting around that problem. I don't want my book to depend on people having to go find research libraries that have like one of 3 copies in English of Bogdanov's masterwork. So I made a whole bunch of PDFs of these obscure out-of-print books and made a reader out of it. It has a few other, and here's, you know, a little text of Bogdanov's and Marx's on the Verso website. So there I had to kind of create the archive that went with the book so that the thing could circulate a little bit outside the research library space, which we now are all in a way. I mean, I can log into my university's research library remotely, but I can't access any of the physical objects I might need to do research. So we're all in that situation that I felt readers who didn't have access to a handful of prestige institutions would be in. So that was that one. I don't have General Intellects to show, but it's a collection of pieces on other people. So I was writing about, came out of my grad seminar, which was like, let's read, you know, like 15 books in 15 weeks. And here's like 15 things that are interesting. I was teaching in the liberal studies program here at New School, which had a very great books orientation. So I did the opposite. So rather than those are all the great books going back in time, like let's do 15 books that are interesting right now, but across a wide range of fields. So the book grew out of several iterations of that. And the constraint was I could only write 4,000 words on one writer. So 4,000 words on Bruno Latour, or 4,000 words on Beth Pofanelli, or 4,000 words on Fred Moten. Like that would be the constraint. And then General Intellects is first of what I think will now be 2 books that sort of organize those. And it's all about, if you like, designing an intellectual space in between ways of processing different intellectual histories. So you get to whoever it is, Paolo Verno or Zizek or whoever have processed intellectual tradition, but how do you create the interstitial space between those things so that you can see that each does certain work conceptually, but none can be sovereign over all the others. And to me, that was a fundamental lesson of Bogdanov. So there's no one discourse that's sovereign over all the others. What would be comradely knowledge production where all forms of knowledge production are equal? So that was the whole project. And so I can't show you the physical books. I don't have one at home. But I got to work with the people at DIS. One of my students interned with them, and that led to making, we chose 3 of the chapters and did 5-minute videos around them. And the whole thing was a joke on the figure of the talking head. I'll play a few seconds of this, and it's like, these were the most excruciating things that I ever had to make. I also don't like looking at myself pre-transition. So, you know, I may have to avert my eyes for a sec here.
About is Paul B. Preciado. What I like about Preciado is the way they take away the whole idea of a natural body. It's not just trans bodies that are products of medical, pharmaceutical industries, but cis bodies as well.
So as you can imagine, I'm lying on this weird angle, and there's like a cheat sheet someone is holding with all the keywords on it, sort of at some weird other angle over my face while, you know, I'm all there. And then I have this, you know, like weird blue neck thing on so that I can be, appear as if my head is separate to the body. And the body was this much younger, much hotter, you know, cis man who was interning at DIS at the moment. My one regret about, we did 3 of these, one's on Sian Nai, I can't remember who the 3rd one was. And when we did Preciado, I really wanted the body that would appear to be my disembodied one to be a woman's body, and I just didn't have the nerve to ask because it was like before I was ready to come out. So that's my additional little story about doing the videos for DIS, which was sort of about, yeah, how would you get conceptual stuff to circulate, you know, in a sort of internet mediated space. So thinking of themselves as kind of conceptual television, if you like. So that was my contribution to it, but I really don't like looking at that anymore. And the one I want to end with, that Peter alluded to at the start, connects up to a really very different book. I do have a whole little sideline in kind of experimental nonfiction, and as I think I was sort of suggesting, that to me there was a kind of avant-garde approach to writing involved, particularly in a Hacker Manifesto. Like, it's written in a made-up language, for crying out loud. And it's a prose poem. I just didn't tell anybody it was. Like, if you say your book's a prose poem, you're going to be with a poetry press and they'll do 200 copies. But you say it's a theory book, and you know, you can sell 10,000 units. Like, there's something weird about how genre works with that. But this does break a little bit with some of the other stuff. And I wrote it after I'd come out socially as a trans woman, but before I started hormones, because I figured that would mess with my writing ability, which it really did. And so it's kind of a different kind of text. And yeah, I came out in February. I didn't get to tour it. I got to launch it, but not to tour it. I would actually be in California right about now, touring this book if things had worked out differently. But I didn't get to do that. And the plan was to do readings in bookstores with other trans and gender non-conforming authors who are locally well known, and that's a fairly standard strategy for, you know, getting your book to circulate. It's a little story about the image on the cover, but I may leave that for questions if we run out of other things to talk about. The cover art's by my partner Kristen Clifford. But then this is the piece I did after lockdown, and it's not actually based on text from the book, but on writing that sort of, you know, went past it, and is maybe the second book. Second book won't be called Lonesome Cowgirl, but I sort of kept the cowgirl figure for the album. We've been having this family joke for the last month about, you know, like, I'm going to drop my album, and then I'm going to go on tour, and I'm going to fire the band, and then I'm going to do. So yeah, kids think it's hilarious. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, I can't sing a note. I have absolutely no musical confidence whatsoever. So one has to approach this with a certain level of lightness. And it says on the album cover, does that embiggen if I click on it? Yeah. This is bedroom rave art. Because I went back to rave culture after I transitioned. Like, I sort of remembered that in the 90s, the thing where I felt most at home in my own body was raves. And so I hadn't really been there for a while, and I went back and found that really quite wonderfully helpful. And of course, all that is shut down. I don't get to go out and dance like that anymore. Zoom raves are a thing, but it's interesting media that you could, you know, write about, but it's not quite the same vibe when you're alone in your own kitchen. So it's bedroom rave art, and the constraint with this is I recorded vocal using the cheap-ass microphone that's in my apartment, and just using my own phone. You can hear the sirens in the background on the audio recordings from my side in this work, because we were 2 blocks from Elmhurst Hospital, which is ground zero of the pandemic in New York City. So yeah, I recorded 15-minute spoken word pieces, and gave 4 of them to DJs that I happen to like. And on the 2 tracks that are actually on the bit that's released, both are mentioned in those pieces. So the first one is mostly about a rave called Unta. It's co-organized by Nick Bazzano. So I got Nick to do the setting that would go underneath it. The second one is about going to like the one night a month in a queer club in Brooklyn that's specifically for trans people, which is Body Hack at Mood Ring, and discovering a DJ there, and then taking that back to my girlfriend and breaking up with her is like the piece. Conceptually, they're kind of about what kind of space gets produced by techno in the space of the rave, is I think the conceptual work that those pieces were doing. Anyway, I sent out 4, 2 I didn't get back. It turns out some people like me really like to work under the sort of strain that COVID-19 produces. And some people either A, really don't have that relation to it, or have other obligations and are not really in a position to be spending time making art and stuff. So I'll just give you a little sample of what that sounds like, if it'll play. Bandcamp's not taking their cut. If you want to buy things on Bandcamp today, the money goes to the artists, except for what the financial services take. Come on, I'm just getting, yeah, preloaded this. I think that would try to play, but it won't. So, I don't know, maybe you'll have to hear that on your own time. Let's see if it'll stop. Here we go. All right, so that's kind of what I got. And to sort of just to conclude by just sort of extrapolating something from it, I think I would just want to read the little text because it does sort of sum up a method that spans all of this work in different ways. It just says, this is bedroom rave art. We can't close our eyes, touch the beat, sense the stranger next to us. Let's remember the good times. Let's make art where we are with the tools at hand, quick and simple. Let's dance alone together. So when the time comes to make the world over, we'll know what feelings, sensations, concepts to make it with. So some of that's a little bit specific to where we are in isolation, but some of it I think is the punk rock method that goes back to me learning, a little bit of different media already in the late 70s, and then through that transfer out of, mass Fordist media production into whatever you would call this. I call it the vectoral, but call it what you like, the media space that we're in now. All right, so that's what I got, and I shall stop talking there. I see there's things in chat, and happy to talk about it.
I have Happy Flesh loaded. Do you want to play a little bit of it so that? Oh, you're muted now.
Oh, please do. Yeah, just a few seconds of that would be great.
Okay. Yeah. Is that coming through?
I am one of 3 transsexuals stepping from the car, somewhere in Brooklyn. You step out first. You look incandescent, Instagrammable under street lamps and the warm glow of bright light. But then maybe it's me who's well lit. I follow you while Katie brings up the rear. You two are young and pretty and hot in raver black while I'm in my wife Begoin's viscose dress and magenta Converse sneakers. I feel more confident we'll get in if I'm sandwiched between this fabulous. You sashay straight past the waiting line with a slender finger in the air and out.
Okay, great. Again, thank you so much for that. And I would love to take questions, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to moderate between the two of us. There are a couple of things I think I left out in my introduction. The first is that you are a professor at, as you noted, the New School at Lang, and that you've been teaching there for more than a decade, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I kind of I became part of the furniture.
And then
I leave.
And the other thing is that I didn't give any credit to Delina Tran, who was also involved with Harad Saab in organizing all of this. So thanks to them. And with that, can I pass things over to all of you for questions or comments? And I'm trying to think. You can also, if you don't feel like asking, you can always type it into chat, and I'll be happy to kind of do that. But I mean, I can. So it's always interesting to see how anxieties translate from the real world into virtual spaces. And that first question is usually left to the moderator because everybody's just sort of sitting there. So, I would just say that, you talked about, you brought up the kind of term of sovereign knowledge and general intellect, of course, a Marxian concept to begin with that I think you did such a nice job reworking in that book. And there's just, for me, what I find so interesting about what you just presented is the materialist aspect of sovereign knowledge, that it takes so many different forms. Music, it takes, you're doing videos, obviously growing out of your own experience as a journalist, you kind of see this as taking so many different forms. And I guess one of the questions that I'd ask is, how do you work your collaborations? Because one of the things that I'm so impressed by is the level of the work that you've managed to produce. And I know that's very hard. So I guess I'd like to ask about the collaboration.
The first thing it just reminds me is like my entire career, such as it is in academia, comes from knowing how to ask the first question at conferences. Because I'd been a journalist, and like, that's your shot, right? You want to not be, like, you get in there early and you set the whole agenda for question time. So I just took that over when I was trying to do scholarship, and it worked like a charm. That's how I got jobs. And so I highly recommending that, to figure out how to. So it means you have to be thinking of the question in the middle of the talk, Yeah, so that was my thing. That was how I got here. Yeah, the thing I like about writing is the solitude. Like, there is this sort of temperament thing with media that people end up in. So I've been, very accessory to certain kinds of film production, but it's really not, not for me. So then it's like, okay, how's this going to work where I'm working with others, and then also when there's inequality built into it. I forgot, there's a whole other one I could have done, which was Constant's New Babylon, which is this like beautiful, imagined sort of utopian landscape that was all built with models. And I worked with an architect, and we made it into like 3D rendering that you could do a walkthrough, like what would be a digital version of that. And Constant never did one for New York City. He did, Amsterdam and Paris, and I forget where else. Like, what if you sort of reimagined a utopia built on top of New York, and we did it digitally. But sometimes there's the, it's like, oh, okay, there's forms of inequality built into this, because I'm the teacher, you're doing this for credit, and so on. And I feel like it's incredibly important to, and I've not named all of the collaborators in all these projects in talking about it, because honestly, my memory is not that good anymore. But I hope in the documentation of them, they all highlight how much, these are other people's work rather than mine. Because I think that's sort of the thing that, if you can offer that as a gift, you can do all sorts of stuff, where you're just kind of like, oh, I'll enable this, but it's your thing, and you make it how you want it. And to be open to the surprise of it. Like, I had very different ideas about what some of these things would be before I kind of started working with people, and to just sort of like go with the surprise kind of thing. So Lonesome Cowgirl is really not how I thought that was going to sound. Particularly the side B is like really different to what I was imagining. And the first time I played it through, I'm like, I don't know about that. And the second time, I'm like, that's what Eves was feeling. Like, I get it now. I see my own writing in a different way because of that. So that's it, I think, is the relinquishing of control. And even though you're caught in these inequalities of relationship and so on, and to think pretty clearly about who's getting paid and all that, but to kind of think about the gift is sort of enabling people to make it their own.
That's great. And I think that especially becomes incredibly important as we're trying to figure out how we can make these kinds of works in an expanded field. Other people, you can send me a quick message or just leap in right now, unmuting yourself.
somebody described it as wonderfully weird in the chat, which is on a good day. Like some of it's just weird, you know, like it doesn't always work, you know, like there's also the depths of stuff that you're not seeing, you know, the abandoned projects and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the idea of sort of liberating yourself to write about other things is really hard, even after you enter the academy and get tenure. Like there's this sense that you're always supposed to stay in your lane.
Yeah, I never really did that to start with, though. So you know, I kind of I was always, you know, it's so much more fun being a guest in somebody else's field, and there's sort of like a lot of like being any other kind of guest. There's a lot of work you have to do to be a good guest or to try to. But yeah, I kind of somehow. And I, you know, you should see the things I get asked to vet manuscripts of. It's you know, it's like I cannot possibly keep up with these 14 freaking things that I once was a guest on, you know. So it's like I really don't know very much about like the Soviet Marxism of the 1920s, you know, like I just dabbled in that, you know. So yeah, you kind of got to know your limitations with this as well. But it's like I think there's sort of a way that certain parts of particularly humanities scholarship ended up rightly being mostly about drilling down to something very, very specific. But then how do you connect the specific things together is the bit that requires a bit more thought, yeah? And perversely doing this is also a kind of specialization. So, you know, you have this, but I think we could work a little more on that to figure out how those things can become connected. There's precedence for that, but to me, that's sort of like the key work is how the different sort of fields of knowledge kind of interact and collaborate. Yeah, that seems to me to be a huge problem.
Graham actually asked a question in the chat, and I wondered if you could just read it out loud.
Yeah. This is a large question. You have to love a kind of a caveat like that, right? How as a creative thinker, thank you, I don't know about that, do you maintain hope in the current enterprise of humanity? I don't really. Yeah, kind of, you know, and one does have to specialize in certain things, and hope is really not something I can do. But like delirium I can do. Like I mean, like some of these kind of works really do have a delirious quality to them. And they're maybe a little dissociated, you know. If I talk to my therapist a lot about that, but maybe there's ways one can use that creatively to get out of the kind of immediacy of the space. So yeah, I'm not somebody who can, you know, sort of lay down the hope card, but maybe the possibility card is one I can play. Like here are all of these, if we think less in terms of, in the theory world, it's like an apostolic succession, you know, like only the great philosophers trained by certain great philosophers are the ones that can, and they're all white guys who all go back to a handful of schools. But what if we explore all the little byways around that and treat the archive as full of all of these wonderful dead ends that you can open up again, you know, to find other paths of possibility in the aesthetic domain, in the conceptual domain, and so on, and reroute them and recombine them. So, you know, for example, my books on situationists are all about the minor characters, you know, like this obligatory Debord character, but there's a whole Alexander Trocky character. Jacqueline de Jong, I think, is, you know, really underappreciated. I take Michelle Bernstein seriously as a theorist. You know, not surprisingly, you start adding the sort of the women, the queer people, people of color into the story if you start looking at all the little byways of people who didn't, you know, become canonic. So yeah, I think it's more about possibility than hope.
Yeah, and
Graham, did you want to?
Oh, I was just going to say, so maybe about the potentiality and kind of looking for alternate versions instead of trying to drum up hope for what's happening now, just thinking of alternatives that haven't been explored.
Yeah, and there could be, and I want to make that readable a few different ways. Like there could be possibilities that have futures, or they could be futures that are pasts. and there could be a practice of mourning that has to happen about the absence of those possibilities. So I want to leave that a little bit open in terms of where readers might want to go with it, rather than kind of prescribe a tone to which you would read that. Naturally, a very pessimistic person, so I'm not someone who can do the hope thing.
We've got a question from Evelyn Masso. I think you have to unmute yourself,
yeah,
Evelyn.
I'm muted. Hi.
There you go. Okay, perfect.
Hi, McKenzie. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about how you think about the like border between like prose poetry and like prose or like nonfiction. You mentioned earlier about Hacker Manifesto being like a prose poem in disguise, and I think I've seen you clip somewhere on Twitter about reading Juliana Huxtable's Mucus of My Pineal Gland as a poetry work. So I'd just be curious to hear like a little bit about how you think about that.
Yeah, I kind of read Juliana's work as theory. Like I think it's sort of, there's a way in which genre categories can be sort of about marketing as much as anything else, or, you know, access to possible performance spaces. And I thought, oh, I'll read Juliana as prose. And also as theory. And I have a whole I have a book coming out on Kathy Acker. And I thought, oh, well, no one's really read her as a theorist for a while. What if I redo that? And so there's a way you can think of the genre of the text you're reading as something that's open, and sort of read it through a different genre prism. And genre just gives you expectations, yeah? I don't know that there's... And genres can mutate and change. Some are very wedded to certain conventions and play with them quite self-consciously, like the horror movie. Some are a lot more open, like a prose poem. Like a prose poem is just a dozen of line breaks, right? That's sort of about it. And I, as a self-confessed failed poet, you know, like I had to work in prose. Prose writers are like the working class of the writing world, because you've got to fill the whole page. You know, you don't get to leave vast white spaces like you're an aristocrat and that's your domain. But I did want to think about how do you get things out of narrow kind of coterie readerships and get them to circulate in different ways. But I didn't want to write, and probably don't have the facility to write, the sort of conventionally accepted nonfiction prose, particularly on the American model. There's just things about the conventions of it that aren't native to me and aren't particularly appealing. So yeah, I think all the books have some elements of play with what the possibilities of what writing in the sort of theory genre could possibly do. And it's had a connection to poetic for a long time anyway, at least since Nietzsche, right? Arguably since Marx. I mean, Marx is, you know, interesting to me as literature as much as anything else. So yeah, but it's sort of not wanting to do, and not that there's anything against it, it's just not my particular thing to do the thing that would be a chapbook for 20 people, but what's the thing that has that relation to language, but you can get to circulate a little bit differently, a bit beyond that. Partly just the vanity of liking to have things, you know, circulate and be on people's coffee tables and stuff, rather than, and that's why I was a little surprised Hacker Manifesto did so well, because it is my most impenetrable book, frankly.
Anybody else, or have we kind of reached our Zoom limit for Friday afternoon?
I've got a question, if that's all right.
Oh, great. Yeah, is that Ben?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you just mentioned Kathy Acker, and that brings up the I'm Very Into You book, which is a wonderful collection of correspondence. And it seems like that's one of many instances that you've been involved in, like virtual spaces and like the potentially liberatory aspects of them. And I'm just wondering, you know, in this moment, if you continue to feel that way, that they open up possibilities, or if that's affected, you know, your experience of this moment.
Not so much. There, you know, I have my sense of the 80s and 90s agriculture is, you know, we won some battles and then lost the war. There are a whole other possibilities for what those media forms could have been. But that was you know, before the big money arrived and made it into something else and figured out how to extract value out of it. And in Capital is Dead, I really see that as a new mode of production based on extracting surplus information. So like the sort of affordances that we used to get to play with aren't really there. And then you're inside media forms whose main purpose is surplus extraction. So they generate like huge amounts of noise. So yeah, you know, a huge piece of my writing practice these days is just Twitter. Like it's sort of where I think and socialize at the same time, but you're like forever coming up against the fact that it's not designed for that purpose at all. It's designed to extract surplus information out of us, you know, pump advertising back at us and that sort of thing. So not so much. And I think, but it was maybe why the letters in, or the emails in I'm Very Into You had a certain recherche kind of appeal to a younger readership. I mean, it's partly that we're already acting, you know, in a way that would become a lot more common later. But also that it did sort of seem like there was a space of kind of play and possibility that were maybe not quite there in the same way. Yeah, I think that was one of the little side projects. Sorry?
Matthias Lambert had a question that's on the chat, but if Matthias wants to read it, that would be great, or ask it.
Sorry, somebody just came in after it. Yeah, it's and I maybe have to read some of this so people have the context.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, your interest in the side characters of historical theoretical movements got me thinking about fanfic forums for video games, books, etc. I'm curious what you think about such spaces and their cultural reputation. Cultural reputation is kind of key there, yeah, especially compared to the more widely accepted parallel novels like Le Guin's Lavinia, which I haven't read, so I can't comment on that one. Yeah, and I kind of did the reverse in gamer theory, and in retrospect, there's sort of like nervousness about cultural capital involved in that. So the chapter on The Sims makes all of these theorists characters in The Sims. So it's as if Walter Benjamin was a character in The Sims. So I'm like importing, you know, whatever cachet attaches to that name into that space. I've since gone on Walter Benjamin's strike, by the way. It just seemed like everywhere and it become a sort of doxer. So I just like refused to do Benjamin. Like students come to me and I'm like, it's great, but I'm not talking about the Benjamin. I'm on strike with that, you know. But Walter Benjamin is wonderful and lovely and people should read him. But I just like, yeah, personally, I can't do it anymore. Yeah, so there's sort of like a way that we're in the middle of reconfiguring aesthetics around different values, around different hierarchies, around different senses of what part of the production cycle can be commodified as well. So I think all of those are interesting questions. And I think Sian Nai's book, Our Aesthetic Categories, is sort of helpful in that, because it does more work than I think she knows it does, because she's mostly thinking about literary examples. But if you sort of dethrone, you know, your sort of classic major aesthetic categories, such as the beautiful and the sublime, and we were so obsessed with the sublime back in the 80s, and talk about minor aesthetic categories, and the three she chooses is the cute, the interesting, and the zany, then whole other areas of cultural material open up for things like a fine art practice. And one would sort of create different relationships between the vernacular and the refined, or what really just means the commodifiable in the senses recognizable in the art world. So yeah, I think how one plays in those spaces and finds the affordances of it, because that's the whole history of cultural production, yeah, is moments of reflective bifurcation and loop back and reflection on something that's vernacular is what creates an art, yeah? Like those are the moments when it kind of gets great. And we're still figuring out how to do that with some of these forms. And then, someone's talking about the COVID era as looping us back to the 90s, which I really need to think about some more. For those of us who remember the 90s, of how that connects, and how there's a kind of self-isolating through connection that the internet made possible at that moment. And then there's a remark about Twitter from Sarah being my platform too, connecting this way in the context of mainstream social media, political economy. Feels a bit like queering. Yeah, I mean, I kind of ended up willy-nilly in the discourse, as particularly trans women call it on Twitter, which is a kind of, it has a tendency to turn on itself every now and then, and they're like old heads have to like intervene and kind of stop it from becoming, you know, stop the medium from infecting the people on it with its sort of divisiveness. So yeah, I'm kind of interested in how one thinks through what you can build out of things like Twitter, and that's where nothing I can mention about Reverse Cowgirls. It's got, you know, block quotes from other writers appear throughout. So yeah, on this page it just says Gary, Indiana, and then there's like a chunk of a Gary, Indiana novel. In that case, only a few sentences. And that to me was like, oh, well, one of the things I like about my Twitter thread is I follow a bunch of writers who put interesting paragraphs of what they're reading into the feed. So like every morning I open it up and I'm reading, it's like, oh, there's a paragraph from this Sarah Schulman novel. It's one I haven't read, but this is a beautiful paragraph. And it's there in my feed, along with, you know, some in-jokes I share with some people, a couple of news headlines, some alerts about things we have to go write a petition for. So I wanted to sort of bring that back fold that back into the standalone long form, as Peter said at the beginning, work. Yeah, like how do you get that slight interference effect of other texts coming into that one? So I'm interested also in how things like Twitter, you know, work back into, and maybe in a less literal way of putting actual tweets in the text and so forth. I didn't want to do that. It interrupts the typesetting for one thing. Yeah.
I think, you know, we've been going for a little more than an hour plus, and how I think that was what we sort of said we were going to do. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, and I'm going to leave it open for maybe one more if we want to, and if not, we can, let's see, anything else? No, I think, you know, thank you. That was really just delightful. You know, we'd really like, you know, to express our appreciation for your visit. You should check out, I sent out a number of links for her work. You know, I think that, you know, I hope you can come back someday in the flesh. With that, just this was a magnificent start to our Zoom salon. So, you know, all of our appreciation to you for taking your time.
Happy May Day.
Happy May Day.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you.
Bye for now.
Okay, bye.